My mother struck me across the face in front of 200 wedding guests because I refused to hand over the keys to my own home. My diamond earring left my ear before the sting even reached my face. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I bent down, picked the earring off the marble floor, and walked out of that ballroom without a single word. 1 hour later, a man in a gray overcoat walked through those same doors. The moment my mother saw his face, she started screaming. She had no idea I had been waiting 3 years for her to make this exact mistake. My name is Sable Winthrop, and for most of my adult life, I was the daughter my family used as a cautionary tale. Sable left home at 19. Sable doesn't call enough. Sable thinks she's better than us because she has money now. None of that was true. What was true was this. At 19, I watched my father sign our family restaurant into bankruptcy because he refused to listen to anyone, including the accountant he'd hired twice and ignored twice. I watched my mother spend what little savings remained on a wedding of the decade for my younger sister, Kaylee, while I ate ramen in a shared apartment and worked 2 jobs to pay my own way through college. I remember the exact night I decided to leave. I was 20 years old, sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of tuition bills, when my mother walked in wearing a new coat she'd bought for a dinner with my father's business partners. When I asked how we could afford it, she told me some things mattered more than my little school expenses. I paid that semester's tuition with a loan I spent the next 6 years repaying. I didn't leave because I hated them. I left because staying meant drowning quietly while everyone insisted the water wasn't rising. The next decade of my life belonged entirely to me. I studied property finance, took an entry-level analyst job at a real estate firm, and spent my 20s learning how to read a broken building the way other people read a room, where the damage was structural, where it was cosmetic, and where it could be rebuilt into something worth more than anyone expected. By 28, I had started my own consulting firm, helping investors turn failing commercial properties into profitable ones. By 31, I had offices in 2 cities and a client list that no longer needed my last name to trust my judgment. I bought my penthouse the year my company had its first 7-figure year. It sat on the 17th floor of a converted warehouse building near the river, 3 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, a private terrace where I drank my coffee every morning before the city fully woke up. I paid for it in cash, using money I earned rebuilding other people's failing properties, the exact skill my father never once let me use on his own. I legally changed my last name the year I turned 26. Winthrop was my grandmother's maiden name, the one relative who ever told me, without qualifiers or conditions, that I was capable of something. Vance, my father's name, had started to feel less like a family and more like a debt collectors kept adding interest to. My parents never understood the name change. My mother called it a betrayal. My father called it an insult to everything they'd sacrificed. I called it the first boundary I'd ever successfully held, and I never once regretted it. Kaylee, my younger sister, grew up under a very different roof than I did, or at least, that's how it felt from where I stood. She was the golden child, the one who stayed close, the one who let our parents plan her prom dress, her college major, and eventually every detail of her wedding. She met Grayson Holt during her senior year of college. He was charming in the specific way people are when they've never had to work particularly hard for anything, including affection. Within a year, they were engaged, and my mother had already started clipping venue photos into a binder labeled, without irony, Kaylee's Fairy Tale. I paid for half of that wedding. Not because anyone asked nicely, because my mother called me crying 2 months before the date, insisting they couldn't afford the venue Kaylee had fallen in love with, and that if I really loved my sister, I would step in the way a real family would. I transferred $40,000 without complaint. Family, I told myself, still meant something to me, even when the meaning only seemed to flow in one direction. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until months later, was that my parents had already decided, quietly and without asking me, that the wedding gift for Kaylee and Grayson would come from me too. Not my money this time. My home. The wedding was held at a restored botanical hall 2 hours outside the city, glass ceilings, hanging orchids threaded through iron trellises, a string quartet my mother had insisted on despite Kaylee originally wanting a playlist. 200 guests filled round tables draped in ivory linen. Cameras everywhere, a hired videographer weaving between them. My father, Harold, loved an audience more than he loved almost anything else in his life, and that night he had the largest one he'd ever commanded. I sat at the family table in a pale green dress, watching my sister glow in lace and pearls, her face lit with a kind of joy I genuinely hoped would last her whole life. For a few hours, I let myself believe this day was simply about her. I toasted with the rest of the room. I danced with a cousin I hadn't seen in years. I told myself, foolishly, that maybe this once, my family could get through an event without turning it into a performance at my expense. Halfway through dinner, my mother leaned over and mentioned, almost casually, that she and my father had a wonderful surprise planned for Kaylee and Grayson. I remember asking what kind of surprise, half distracted, cutting into the food on my plate. She just smiled and said, "You'll see. It's going to be perfect." Something in her tone made the back of my neck prickle, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. I should have trusted that instinct. I'd spent 31 years learning exactly what my mother's smile looked like right before she did something that would blindside someone she claimed to love. Dinner service ended. Plates were cleared. The lighting dimmed slightly for the toasts, and my father stood, tapping a fork against his champagne glass until the entire room fell quiet. "Family takes care of family," he announced, his voice carrying across the hall like he'd rehearsed it. "As a wedding gift to my daughter and her new husband, the keys to a penthouse downtown." My stomach dropped before he even said the address. I knew exactly which keys he meant. "Carol," he said, smiling toward my mother, "bring the box." A white satin box sat beside the wedding cake. Inside it, a silver keyring with a crystal tag that read "Our New Beginning." Grayson had already told 3 separate tables they'd be moving in after the honeymoon. I did not stand. I did not smile. "That penthouse isn't yours to give away," I said, loud enough for the tables nearest us to hear. My father's smile hardened into something else. "Don't embarrass us, Sable. You just announced you're giving away property that belongs to me, in front of 200 people. You embarrassed yourselves." A murmur rippled across the room. Kaylee's expression shifted from joy to something sharper. "Stop being jealous," she snapped, loud enough that the quartet actually stopped playing. "You live alone in that apartment. We're starting a family." "It's not an apartment," I said quietly. "It's my home. I own it outright, with my own money, and no one at this table has any legal claim to it." Grayson shifted beside her, his confident smile faltering for a second, like a man realizing the ground under his feet wasn't nearly as solid as he'd been told. "Sable," my father said, his voice dropping into the tone he used when he wanted witnesses to see him as reasonable, "this is your sister's wedding day. Don't make this about money." "You're the one who made it about my property," I said. "In front of 200 people, with a box and a bow." My mother crossed the dance floor so fast her sequin dress caught the light like static. She leaned in close enough that I could smell champagne on her breath. "We paid for your education," she hissed. "We raised you. Hand over the keys." "No," I said. Her hand moved before I finished the word. The sound of the blow was sharp enough that the quartet fell completely silent. My head snapped sideways. My earring, the pair my grandmother left me, skittered across the marble floor and stopped beneath Grayson's polished shoe. Someone near the back gasped. Someone else, I would later learn, had already started recording. My mother straightened her shoulders like she'd simply corrected a misbehaving child. "Now, give us the keys." I knelt down, slid my fingers under the edge of Grayson's shoe, and picked up my earring. My ear was warm and stinging, but my hands didn't shake. "You shouldn't have done that in front of witnesses," I said. My father laughed, an ugly, dismissive sound. "What are you going to do? Sue your own mother. I looked at my sister. I wanted, for one final second, to see even a flicker of shame on her face. Instead, she held out her hand, palm up, exactly like our mother had. The keys. Sable. Don't ruin my wedding. I placed my earring carefully into my clutch, turned, and walked through 200 silent guests toward the exit. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed. Outside, rain had started, blurring the string of lights strung along the entrance. I stood under the awning for a moment, letting the cold air settle the heat in my face. Then I opened my phone and called the one person I had hoped I would never need to call, not because I doubted him, but because using him meant my family had finally done exactly what I always feared they would. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Cole," I said, watching the flash of camera phones through the hall's tall windows. "The conditions for the clause have been met." A pause. The scrape of a chair on the other end. Did they do it in front of witnesses? 200 of them. And the confrontation, was it physical? "It's on video. Multiple angles, from what I could see." His voice turned businesslike, almost cold with focus. "Preserve everything. Don't delete anything. Don't post anything yourself. I'll be there within the hour." I hung up and, for the first time that night, allowed myself a small, tired smile. Inside, I could hear the quartet starting again. My family had already mistaken my silence for surrender. They had no idea what they'd just started. 3 years earlier, after my business had its first seven-figure year, my father called me for the first time in nearly 8 months. I remember being almost hopeful when I saw his name on my screen. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked for a loan against the family name, a phrase he used as though our surname were collateral I owed him access to. When I said no, calmly and clearly, he didn't argue. He simply changed strategy. I found out weeks later, through a call from a confused title company representative, that my father had an old joint bank account from my college years, one I had genuinely forgotten to close, and he'd attempted to use outdated paperwork from that account to add himself as a co-owner on my brand new property purchase. He claimed, in an email to the title company that I later obtained, that it was customary for a father to co-sign his daughter's biggest investment, and that I had simply forgotten to include him. The title company's fraud department caught the forged signature before the deal closed. They flagged it, contacted me directly, and I quietly resolved it without ever confronting him. I never told my parents I knew what he'd tried to do. Confronting him would have meant a fight I couldn't win with words alone, in a family where the loudest voice always got treated as the correct one. So instead, I did something quieter and far more permanent. I hired Barrett Cole, an estate and property attorney who specialized in family fraud and inheritance disputes, and restructured the ownership of my penthouse into an irrevocable trust in my name alone, the kind of legal structure designed specifically to be forgery-proof and nearly impossible to contest. Buried inside that trust was one very specific clause. It stated that if any family member ever attempted to coerce, publicly pressure, or physically intimidate me into transferring, gifting, or surrendering the property, my attorney was authorized to immediately open a legal review of that conduct, formally document any relative's claim to the estate as barred going forward, and pursue a referral of the earlier forgery attempt to the appropriate authorities, regardless of how much time had passed. I built a safeguard I sincerely hoped I would never need to use. Some part of me even felt guilty drafting it, as though protecting myself from my own parents was an overreaction. My parents answered that question for me. They met the exact conditions of that clause themselves, on camera, in front of 200 witnesses, at their younger daughter's wedding. That was the call I made from the rain-soaked steps of the Botanical Hall. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't dramatic. It was simply a key turning in a lock I had quietly installed 3 years earlier, waiting for a door I hoped would never need to open. I came back inside quietly, standing near the entrance where I could see the whole room without being the center of it, just as Barrett Cole walked through those tall glass doors exactly 58 minutes after I'd called him. He wore a gray overcoat, unremarkable at first glance, and carried a slim leather folder that looked like it belonged in a boardroom, not a wedding, right up until my mother spotted his face across the room. She had met him once before, 3 years earlier, on the day he'd quietly and firmly shut down my father's attempt to forge his way onto my property title. She had spent 3 years pretending that meeting never happened, the same way she pretended most inconvenient truths in our family simply dissolved if nobody spoke them out loud. "You," she said, her voice cracking sharply across the ballroom, silencing the last of the murmuring guests. "What is he doing here?" Barrett didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. That was the thing about him. His calm was more unsettling than any shouting could have been. "Mrs. Pemberton, Mr. Vance, I'm here on behalf of my client, Sable Winthrop, regarding tonight's events at this venue." My father's face went pale under the string lights. "This isn't the place for this conversation." "You made it the place," Barrett said. "The moment you announced ownership of a property you have no legal claim to, in front of 200 guests, and then allowed a physical altercation against my client to occur, on video, in the middle of it." The word altercation landed across that ballroom like a dropped glass, sharp and unmistakable. Barrett opened the folder, though he barely glanced at it. He clearly knew every word inside it by heart. As of tonight, per the irrevocable trust agreement signed 3 years ago, the trust now formally bars any claim either of you, or any other family member, could otherwise attempt to make against Ms. Winthrop's property or estate. Additionally, given the events of this evening, we'll be moving forward with a formal referral regarding the previously attempted forgery on her property title from 3 years ago to the appropriate authorities. My mother's face drained of every trace of color. My father opened his mouth, searching for the sentence that would put him back in control of the room, and closed it again, because for the first time in his life, in front of the audience he loved so much, there was nothing left to bluster his way out of. Kaylee grabbed Grayson's arm, her bouquet nearly slipping from her fingers. "Wait, what forgery? What is he talking about?" Nobody answered her at first. My parents had never told her about the failed attempt 3 years earlier, not because it wasn't relevant, but because admitting it would have meant admitting they'd tried this before and failed quietly. She was finding out in real time, in front of her own wedding guests, exactly how far our parents had gone in the past, and exactly what kind of gift she had just watched them try to hand her. Grayson, to his credit, looked genuinely stunned, his earlier confidence completely gone. "Nobody told me any of this," he said quietly, mostly to Kaylee. "You said the penthouse was already sorted. You said it was a family arrangement." "It was supposed to be simple," my mother said, her voice suddenly smaller than I had ever heard it. "We just wanted to help you two start out right. By taking something that was never yours to give," I said, stepping forward for the first time since walking back in. "You didn't help anyone tonight. You just made sure everyone in this room finally understands who you really are." I stood at the edge of the ballroom, my earring back in place, and watched my family's carefully constructed image collapse in real time, under their own lighting, in front of their own audience. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. Barrett had already said everything that mattered, and 200 witnesses had already seen everything they needed to see. The footage from that night, recorded from 3 separate angles by guests who never expected to capture anything more dramatic than a first dance, spread through our extended family group chats within days. My mother's hand connecting with my face, my calm refusal to hand over keys that were never theirs, the moment Barrett Cole walked through those doors and the room went silent. Relatives who had spent years quietly assuming I was the difficult daughter, the cold one, the one who chose money over family, finally saw, in real time and in my parents' own words, exactly what difficult had actually meant all along. My aunt, who had never once taken my side in any family disagreement, called me the following week just to say she was sorry she hadn't asked more questions over the years. It wasn't much, but it was more honesty than I'd received from that side of the family in over a decade. My parents were formally investigated regarding the earlier forgery attempt on my property title. Because the case was several years old and the original attempt had ultimately failed before any real damage was done, they avoided serious legal consequences in the end. But the investigation itself became public knowledge in a small, tightly connected community where reputation moves faster than any court ruling ever could. My father's remaining business contacts distanced themselves quietly, one by one, the way people do when they'd rather not be associated with a name that's suddenly attached to whispered stories at every dinner party. Kaylee reached out to me almost 2 weeks after the wedding. Not to apologize for what happened that night, at least not directly. She called to ask why I had never told her about the forgery attempt 3 years earlier. I told her the truth. I honestly didn't think she would have believed me over them. For most of our lives, when it came to a disagreement between me and our parents, she had always taken their side without asking many questions. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said something I hadn't expected. She said she understood why I'd stopped trying to explain myself to people who'd already decided who I was. We talk now, occasionally, and carefully, the way you rebuild trust with someone after learning the ground beneath a relationship was never as solid as you thought. She and Grayson eventually found their own apartment, on their own lease, with their own names on the paperwork and no one else's. In a strange way, I think that's the healthiest thing to come out of that entire night. My sister finally starting her marriage on something that actually belonged to her. My parents have not spoken to me since. I haven't reached out either, and I don't plan to, not out of anger, but out of clarity. The trust still stands exactly as Barrett drafted it. The clause did precisely what I built it to do 3 years before I ever needed it. I still live in my penthouse, 17 floors up, with the same view over the river I fell in love with the day I signed the paperwork. Some evenings, standing on that terrace with a cup of coffee, I think back to that ballroom, the silence that followed the sound of my mother's hand against my cheek, the moment the string quartet stopped playing, the exact second 200 people finally understood who my family really was, not through anything I said, but through what they did themselves in full view of everyone. I don't regret the years I spent quietly protecting myself long before anyone ever forced my hand. If anything, I regret only that it took a wedding, one moment of violence, and a room full of stunned strangers for the rest of my family to finally see a truth I had already known for a very long time. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about how things unfolded, about the investigation, about the distance between me and my parents now, about the fact that a night meant to celebrate my sister ended with security escorting 2 guests to their car. I don't. Guilt implies I did something wrong, and the only thing I ever did wrong was wait as long as I did to protect myself with the same seriousness I protected every client's property for a living. I built walls around my business the day I opened it. It took me far longer to build the same walls around my own family, and even longer to admit I needed them. If your family publicly tried to take something that was legally, entirely yours, would you have stayed silent to keep the peace, or would you have already built your own claws, waiting for exactly this moment? Let me know in the comments. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, hit subscribe. Sophie Revenge posts a new story like this every single day.